congratulations to the 4 teams we have here. So I'd like to invite the teams to introduce themselves in speaking order, and if you want to include your gender pronoun, please feel free. Opening up.
Sean speaking first.
So she, please. Opening up.
You don't speak first, no preference?
Monica speaking second. Closing up.
Jan speaking first. Gina speaking second.
Closing up.
Gavin first, preference.
Alright, so the motion before us is this House believes that the US should reverse the pivot to Asian strategy. Welcome the Prime Minister to begin the speech.
Panel, it's been several years since the pivot to Asia began, so the first question you should ask yourself is, in this time, what have we achieved? China has aggressively still militarized. We by and large have not been able to contain that rise. The situation in North Korea has become catastrophically worse to the point that conflict and destabilization is now far more likely, and we haven't even been able to stop the backsliding of countries like the Philippines into becoming more pro-China and more despotic in their behavior. What we believe is this represents a fundamental misjudgment of the way the US approaches foreign policy in Asia. It should by and large not be looking to be oppositional to China and presume that it has the capacity to influence that region directly. Instead, we would prefer a softer touch in the deployment of resources and ideology elsewhere. To be fair, what do we support? We support going back to the pre-pivot strategy where, objectively, resources and, signaling was deployed elsewhere. Now, this debate obviously is about pulling out of Asia entirely. It's a question of two things. First, magnitude, how much we care about China, how much we aggressively put forces and things into that region. And second of all, whether we signal to China that it is our intention to be aggressively in there and we view that as our sphere of direct influence. I'm going to make two arguments in this speech. First of all, why this makes tensions in the region worse. Second of all, why we can do better things elsewhere. First of all, on tensions in the region, I would posit that one of the opposition bench's claims in this debate is going to be to suggest that in the absence of the United States' presence, China would simply take over the region, and that would by and large be for the worse. I want to point out from the outset why this argument should not have a lot of bearing in this debate. First of all, we think there are good reasons why China behaves quite responsibly in the region, or would behave quite responsibly in the region, in the absence of US antagonism. The first reason is that it wants international prominence and recognition. By and large, it sees itself as falling within the sphere of international law more and more in the future. That is the way it gets international credibility. Second of all, for trade, it is not in China's interest, by and large, to see the region destabilized. It doesn't want to be like an evil militaristic power that makes that region unsafe. It simply wants a safe and stable version of that region. But second of all, it's not clear that for the average person in that region, by and large, the US's foreign policy interests there are better for them, for instance, than China would be. So as a comparison on the lives of the people there, it's not clear you should prioritize being under US's sphere of influence compared to, say, China's sphere of influence, given that both of them are quite willing to throw them under the bus at certain moments. Why do you think, however, the situation gets far worse? The first reason is this the pivot to Asia has dramatically inflamed Chinese nationalism and Chinese aggression towards the US for a very simple reason. Historically, China views the region that the US is deploying military forces, military bases and armaments as its direct sphere of influence, right? The area that historically it should have the greatest degree of control over. Add to that the bombastic rhetoric of people like Trump, who aggressively call out China and make them out to be not just an economic enemy, but like a military enemy and like a king of evil in some respects in the world. And that kind of rhetoric stokes up the capacity of people internal to China, particularly people internal to the CCP, to gain power by pushing back. Now that kind of trajectory makes it more likely that China is more aggressive in response. It makes the region more destable, and it forces these two powers to collide where otherwise they would find more areas to come together. The reason this argument is so important is that by and large, we think that a China that simply is in control of everything is probably preferable to a situation in which both of these powers keep fighting together, in which there is so much instability. So even if they fall under the control of China, it's not clear that it's worse. The second reason we think this makes it worse is it forces smaller nations to pick a side. By and large, if you're a country like South Korea, one of the smaller Southeast Asian nations, or even a country like Australia, when the US is militarily attempting to intervene in a way that is antithetical to Chinese interests and sets itself up as being the bulwark against Chinese aggression in the region, that means that as one of these other nations, you have to pick a side. It is much more difficult to politically, economically, and militarily integrate yourself within both of these actors when they are coming to a head against each other. That dramatically reduces the scope of options and makes it less likely those countries can economically integrate within what naturally would be their two most successful and important economic partners. That has dramatic consequences for the lives of the literal billions of people who live in that region. We think a world in which the US and China were not as at loggerheads as they are, as this policy necessarily entails, things would be better. The third thing we think this does wrong is that it makes it more likely of a thing like an accidental misfire occur. Let's be very clear, right? The way in which a war starts in the Asian sphere is something like North Korea, for instance, presuming that a small military operation is actually a precursor to a full-scale attack, a preemptive attack. And that is not an unreasonable presumption given the rhetoric out of the US at the moment has been often to say things like, we might take them out if we think we can get away with it. The problem with the US continually aggressively deploying military forces in the region is you make the consequence and the threat of that far worse. I think a US that is more militarily involved and more militarily aggressive in what it signals in Asia is one that makes that sort of disastrous consequence far more likely. The fourth problem with this sort of policy is you get far less support from China on things that are critically important. Remember that on topics like North Korea, the actor that has naturally the best capacity to influence these decisions is China itself, when it views US presence in the region as not one that is trying to work together towards common aims, but one that is trying to supplant it militarily and prevent it from obtaining its natural hegemony in the region. It is less likely those things work together. That's why I think by and large a lot of progress on things like Asian trade or the North Korea situation have stagnated because this policy and pivot has made it impossible for these sides to work together. And to clarify, the consequence of this argument is that literally the political, economic and military reality in one of the most populous regions of the world has been dramatically worse for the last 7 years, and we think we will fix that by ending this policy. The second argument I'm going to make is why there are better things that we can be doing elsewhere. Before that, I'd love to take a question if anyone's wondering about anything. Sure.
You give this vague elsewhere, but that elsewhere used to be the Middle East. Why do you think they would be welcome there?
Okay, first of all, there are other places like Russia and Eastern Europe, given that was the first example of a place I was going to deploy the forces. So I had 3 examples of places we could deploy forces for, actually. The first is we could do nothing, right? By and large, the US could spend a whole bunch of this money helping the domestic lives of people at home. To the extent that you don't think this is an effective deployment of forces, spending that money on making people not starve or have better services in the United States seems like a very morally worthy cause. The second place we could deploy these things is in Russia and Europe, the third is the Middle East, and the fourth is South America. Now, first of all, why are the two policies, like a pivot to Asia and doing these other things, mutually exclusive? The first reason is cost, simply numerics of how much money and forces we can deploy. The US does not have infinity troops, infinity dollars. The second is political capital, because by and large the US domestic population is not willing to try and police the entire world at any given time. Why do we think we're going to be particularly effective in other spheres? First of all, because in places like Russia and South America, we are far better able to effectively deploy arms. Like, Russia is much poorer and less militarily advanced than China. The South American country may be deploying forces against are basically jokes compared to the US military. So we have a far greater superiority of arms in order to affect foreign policy outcomes as and where we want to. The second reason is that when we pull back from China, we actually gain their support on a lot of these issues, right? In international spheres, international organizations, we can use the leverage of China by pulling back as a bargaining chip in order to help them help other things. We think that pulling out could literally be the thing that allows China, us, for instance, to put pressure on China to stop the rise of Russia in Eastern Europe, or to put pressure on other international organizations to get better consequences in a place like South America. By and large, the history of the last 7 years does not seem to have any major foreign policy success. It has been a waste of a tremendous amount of money and has actively made that region unsafe, we propose.
Thank you. We welcome the leader of opposition.
Firstly, let's be clear. When OG says that it prefers to move the forces near Russia, they actually lose all of their case. Because Russia is extremely symmetrical in all of the things that they've said that China is bad at them. Because actually their problem with China, the biggest problem was the aggressiveness and the chance of war. That we're saying is two main things. Firstly, even if Russia is weaker, and we don't believe that, then obviously it is more aggressive, like we've seen in the Crimea, in Georgia, and those kind of places. So obviously there is more risk of more things to happen. But secondly, we say that that Russia is still very dangerous if a war happens. So what they say about the risks of something big happens, obviously happens in both worlds. So we don't really see any principle behind what they're saying. So I have a few points to rebuttal and then two main things. Firstly, why it creates more security risk within the area and creates more arm race, specifically talking about Japan and South Korea and those nations that will still want to be under the Chinese influence. And secondly, why it actually harms the US and Western influence about other places in the world, like the Middle East, and why it is so important. Before that, a few points of rebuttal. Because firstly, he says that this will solve the US and China's aggression. We think this is false. Firstly, because we say that today, even after this motion, North Korea will still be a problem between the US and Russia, and this is most of what Trump is talking about when he's talking about China's aggression. The second thing Trump is talking about is about the Chinese industry taking American jobs because they are competing against American in lower prices. Therefore, the trade war that Trump's talking about between the US and Russia still stays the same. And Trump saying those aggressive things in Twitter and annoying China will keep happening in both worlds, so we don't think this is going to change. Secondly, so that means that his point about China supporting the US and like more collaboration is not going to happen more. Second, you are saying that it's not going to happen because obviously the US have some security interests in China, and it says we are not taking all of our forces, so the radars or the nuclear submarines will still stay in the area, so China will still be afraid of the US army influence, but just not like helping Japan specifically or South Korea specifically, because this is what is changing within this debate. So when they talk about the nations of the area, so firstly we are saying that they today can be with China, like we see with Laos today, which actually support the Chinese government, and like the US don't influence all of the government. But what we are saying is that after this motion, it is much harder for many countries to not be under the Chinese influence, even if they want to. Because when we talk about other countries, when the US is not protecting them, then China is going to be much more aggressive towards them and control their countries, even if they don't want to. Today we at least give them some options. But thirdly, when they talk about like the other thing that the US will do with its money, we do think that the most reasonable thing, as we see Trump's talk about America's first, is actually Trump taking the troops back to its home. We say that this is detrimental to how other nations perceive the US foreign like actions. So let's talk about the security risk and the arms. Because what we are saying is that already today, in Japan and in South Korea, there is a political right which is really aggressive against China. But today it is being balanced by the US, because every time it takes more power, the US says two things. Firstly, we'll give you more money, more protection, you don't have to be afraid. And secondly, if you will do those things, we will withdraw, and therefore you can't do those things. We think that these things balance the actual aggression that happens. Because listen, he tells you that the aggression is between the US and China, but this is actually false. Most of the aggression in the area is about the South Sea Islands, which is aggression between Japan and China. And what we are saying in this argument is that this specific aggression is going to get worse. Why? Because firstly, like he says, China is a rational actor. And when they know that the US, the big power, is not supporting Japan in the same way, is not putting its influence, and actually like they're saying, with China you can have this region, then obviously China will be more aggressive towards those things like the South Sea Islands. But secondly, because it is going to get the political right within those countries much stronger, because they are afraid that China will do those things, because they think that right now they have to be only dependent on themselves and not on the US. We say that this creates the policies of having a nuclear weapon in China and in South Korea, which is already horrible, because this means more nuclear weapons in this area, more destabilization. We think this is really bad. But more than this, it just creates more political instability and more specifically security instability, because what causes war, as they say, is those simple aggressions that become larger and larger. And we say that when Japan is more afraid of China as a big power, it has to grow its army and do more drills. When South Korea do more drills, those things could affect, like for once, if China has a ship and it's go into the Japan sea, and then Japan destroys this ship, even if it was accidental, now it becomes a huge war, and the US is not there to balance Japan to not destroy this ship. When South Korea has a drill near the North Korean border, Kim Jong-un will likely more attack. So what we're saying is that today the US balance those things up, but when they happen more, his chance of war is more happening. We say this is bad from three reasons. Because firstly, it means that those countries act more like move too much money to security but not have to, and this is already bad. Secondly, there is more militarization and nationalism within that country because the political right is getting stronger. This is already bad. But thirdly, there is actually more chance to actual war between China and those countries. We think this is an enormous risk, and we don't want to take it as the US. Before I move to my second point, yes, second.
Okay, like, if you buy your analysis, like, why would Japan have interest to go in conflict with China if they know they don't have support of the United States?
Because they do think that those islands are there, and they do think that they would be able to deter China in some aspects to those islands specifically, especially when they have nuclear powers, which is what they will do after this motion passes. So to other countries, because what we are saying is that today, when the US leaves, it means that other countries perceive that the US does not support its own allies. This is what has already happened when the US has pivoted to China, but this actually makes this narrative look stronger from a few reasons. Firstly, because it actually strongs the narrative of the US is not backing up its allies, it moved again. Secondly, because specifically Trump's rhetoric of moving your forces home means that it might happen to us and move the forces from here to home again. And thirdly, because specifically countries today, like Russia and China, is perceived to be very stable. Like what happens with Russia in the Middle East, now it supports Assad very much. What happens with China and the belt, which it seems like it supports their followers very much. So why it is critical? Because it means that countries like Iraq or Egypt, that already have different voices within them, like Iraq is backed by Iran in some parts, and Egypt was backed by the Soviet Union, they do have some forces and they were after revolutions. So we do have this thing right now between the more authoritarian and the more democratic regimes that are fighting who will gain control over the country, what will be the stronger voice. When they are going more to serve out the US and more to be under Chinese or Russian influence, that means that there is more chance that those countries won't be democratic in the future, actually be less liberal towards their own citizens. We think that this is extremely bad. Please oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. We welcome Deputy Prime Minister.
I want to do three things in this speech. First, what is Dutch potential in the region? Second, the impact of the US signaling worldwide. And third, the gross under-response to John that we got and why this was so fatal to them. I first want to point out one thing. The bulk of OO's case rests on the assumption that it is the absence of the US within the region that will then embolden China to then wantonly conquer the area. I want to point out that is the underpinning logic of their case, and I think if we break the deadlock to show that it is the US presence in the region which antagonizes China and prompts all of the aggression they talk about, then a significant chunk of their case is gone and they cannot win. First, on tensions within the region, right? So I first want to take out their characterization of China. Their logic is that if the US is not there, China will simply take it as a carte blanche to go into the region and do whatever it wants. Know that China aggressively stoking war with other nations is costly for itself, right? Not only is it economically costly, given that its economy is slowing down and GDP growth is generally slowing down, it's also costly to its domestic population who generally don't want war with other countries as well. Therefore, the only way in which China can pitch that why military intervention or war with other nations is justified is in response to US aggression. The CCP frames it in terms of a threat to nationalism or threat to its own domestic sovereignty, and that's how the cost of intervening then seem more reasonable in proportion. So I think the comparative is this. Without a US presence in the region, it's a lot harder domestically to convince the population of the need for military aggression within the region. It is the presence of the US there which creates the need of a perceived threat that China then has to respond to. So the core logic of OO's case just simply falls away. The second thing we told us on this is that, but if you want the US to go to Russia, the harms are symmetric, so your case is contradictory. No, Russia is fundamentally different from China for three reasons. One, know that Russia's economy is basically failing and is tanking horribly, right? So the cost of intervening in war are just not as great as China, which potentially has the potential to ruin its economy if it just wanted to stoke war elsewhere. But second, Russia's domestic support and support for Putin generally comes from two sources: oligarchs and the security forces. It is not very responsive to domestic population and pressure, whereas China is. So again, China has that self-containing factor which restrains its China from wantonly waging wars, which Russia does not have. The third thing they told us in this is that Trump will still criticize China for trade wars. Yeah, there's a difference between tweeting and actually having US forces in the region. I think the two are quite different in scale and scope. So your side is just going to antagonize China a lot more. The last thing I want to talk about is this, right? Their logic was that now countries like South Korea and Japan are going to feel insecure, they're going to militarize. The first thing I want to point out is that even if this is true, they never told us why the alternative of Japan or South South Korea militarizing and therefore causing tensions with China is a worse prospect than US-China tensions. Note that US-China tensions are probably worse for the reason that, one, the US and China are far greater military actors, so any military tensions that result are probably far greater in scale. But two, note that a lot of countries are codependent on both the US and China for things like trade, for economic aid. So if countries are placed in a position where they are forced to take sides, I think that is a detrimental outcome that is far worse than any sort of tensions or militarization of China and Japan. But note also, why would the militarization of Japan and South Korea not come about? Note that they told us the far right in Japan is a strong force, but there are also two critical realities they neglect. The first is that only a third of Japan's domestic population supports the remilitarization of the army, right? The other domestic factor they ignore is that the Liberal Democrats, who are the largest opposition force and challenge to Abe, staunchly believe in not overturning Article 9 of the Constitution and staunchly believe in keeping Japan nuclear free. I think it's the popular domestic pressure which will keep Japan from remilitarizing to the extent they tell you about. But last of all, I want to tell you that even if, because the alternative they have to defend is US being the one creating the military drills. That is bad because China then has to respond in time with creating their own military drills as well. So the dynamics of escalation that we talk about still happen on their side anyway, just with a far greater actor that China has been historically a lot more antagonistic towards. Therefore, all the harms we talk about militarization also accrue to their side. The last response to this I want to point out is that Japan and South Korea will just be a lot more hesitant to remilitarize if they know they don't have the US backing in terms of military support and aid. The reason why Japan and Abe are so wantonly aggressive in the status quo is they know that the US is going to come in and have their back regardless of what it does. This is precisely because of the pivot to Asia and security guarantee, right? Without that assistance, I think China and South Korea are going to be a lot more cautious and wary, and in turn, that reduces a lot of need for China to be wantonly aggressive in return. The next thing they told us is about the impact on US signaling. The logic goes something like this, right? Once the US reverses its pivot to Asia, it will be seen as being uncommitted, and therefore countries like Iraq and Egypt will be concerned. The first thing I want to point out is they never gave any reason as to why, even if this logic were true, the impact on countries like Iraq and Egypt were more important than, say, possible US devoting its resources to places like South America or Russia that John told you about. Why do you think this is more important? Just because the security threats in those regions are probably far greater, but there is a strong need for US intervention, right? Venezuela is literally a failing state now, and without US assistance, it's probably going to remain so and descend into nothingness. Russia and the threat of it moving into the Baltics is a lot more of a threat than I think Iraq or Egypt, some unidentified threat which they never told us about. Closing.
Instead of giving us a list of possible alternatives the US could do, could you tell us which is the most likely option that we'll pursue?
Yeah, okay, so one, I think the likeliest, there are two, I'm not sure we have to commit to one, right? So obviously it depends on a whole host of factors. If the US thinks that domestic support means that it's more likely to devote those resources to education, then fine, so be it. If the threat of Russia is economically expanding day by day, then fine, it can go to the Baltics. I'm not sure why I'm forced to defend one of those. But my last response to the US signal argument is this. I think the real reason and the problem with countries like Iraq is the US's half-heartedness when they intervene and then mid-intervention decide they want to pull out. I don't think we have the same kind of half-heartedness because what we're doing is quite unequivocally clear. We've been there for say 10 years and after that we say this is no longer a security guarantee, we are moving away. So I think we eschew a lot of the problems they talk about. What did John tell you that went unresponded to? I think first his analysis as to how China is likely to react in the sense that it will not go berserk because of its interests both in terms of projecting itself as soft power and in terms of wanting to maintain trade links when grossly unresponded to. And it is that characterization of China which took out a lot of the harms that they were talking about, right? But the next important thing is this. Even if China just asserts itself in the Southeast Asia, so what? I think China is by and large quite a good actor and it has been providing a lot of condition-free loans to countries like the Philippines, etc., or like Cambodia in terms of the AIIB. And I think they gave us no reason as to why the US is going to be any more benign given that it's done some pretty terrible things in countries like the Philippines itself, right? So I'm not sure why, even on comparison, the US is a more benign actor we should blindly place our faith in rather than China. But the last thing is that he told you there's necessarily an odd cost in terms of popular and economic cost in terms of where we want to devote resources to. And I think in terms of a moral calculus, we probably should be concerned about a more aggressive Russia that actually has thoughts of conquering the Baltics rather than stationing troops in Asia, where by and large countries are self-sufficient domestically in terms of defense, and where there is simply no need for such a strong US presence. On all of these counts, they only make the situation in Asia a region of instability. That is something we don't stand for.
OG has a weird notion of trying to say we're going to be friends with everyone and no one at the same time. We're going to have enough resources to invest in everyone, and people are just going to welcome us back as the United States without any repercussions. I'm going to show why we think that the likely scenario is more aggression on the Eastern Front and why other places would not be as welcoming or as beneficial, according to what we hear from OG, meaning that there is no reason to make this change. However, it is important to notice before that when we say reverse a foreign policy action, this is a very public thing, meaning that everyone in the world is going to be aware. Just like Obama loudly proclaimed that he has this pivot, we think that it's very likely that Trump would also go to the media and say, I'm reversing this, and he's going to pin it even on Obama, meaning that when he does that, not only does it look that he's simply changing his mind, but also he looks like he's doing it for reasons that are stupid, meaning that other countries are more likely to think that the United States is not going to be a good ally, and we would not gain South America now wanting us back, or places like Egypt, Iran, and so on saying, yes, the United States would be our friend once again after they deserted us, went to that other place, and now say, we're back. So we don't think that this is going to change. Now, let's talk about the region. Because notice that, first of all, Etsuko ignores the fact that war can erupt with North Korea. The only attack that she gives us is about war with China, meaning that already we have more chances of the Kim dynasty doing something that they perceive is threatening them, doing an action that they think would not be met if the United States is not present there, is not giving a nuclear umbrella, and so on, which is already bad according to their logic coming from PM. But secondly, they are ignoring the fact that even when we talk about China, a perceived threat exists on both sides, meaning that it can happen here or there. What changes? The fact that now China feels stronger if it has a military against it that is not as strong as the United States. They know that the United States, even if it decides to later on intervene, would take at least 2.5 weeks to get there, which is now the time that is going to take them to deploy fully. But now we have less of people on the ground. China is more likely to go for a blitz war, taking over the islands and setting the record straight. And this is the thing that changes because it is indeed rational. But then Etsuko asks us, okay, so why is it worse than a war in status quo? Because she ignores the fact that EUDC says that right now the United States is curbing everyone in the area. We say that the fact that the United States does not want war with China is good because now it gives enough of a protection. It's a good threat because of mutually assured destruction, but it has the ability now not to do small drills, not to do the kind of thing that can be perceived more as a threat and not to be more aggressive. And we say that this is extremely good. Also, we say that those armies in Japan and South Korea are more likely to be with their hand on the trigger because they're not as they don't have all the resources, they don't have all the know-how. We think that they are more likely to be afraid because they feel like they have no backing, meaning that it's likely for one soldier to accidentally push a wrong button, shoot the wrong person on the border, and so on. And this does not happen with the United States. But then they try to say, but Japan and South Korea, they would not militarize. First of all, they are basing this on status quo, where there is no need to militarize. But now there will be more of a perceived threat, meaning that the rhetoric on the right is going to become much stronger in the day after and is going to convince more people. Now notice that considering the fact that there is historical animosity between Japan and China, we don't think that the Japanese would simply say, okay, we're willing for China to be a hegemon, we're willing to risk our economy, and so on, meaning that they are going to do whatever they can to protect their sovereignty and their national feelings. And we say that this is important if we look at this from a global perspective, meaning that we want countries to remain as they are. We don't want them to be puppets, even if this is on the expense of slight tensions. We say that the moment those tensions are controllable by the United States, we can have all of those things, and they provide us with no reason why this would not happen. But then they try to talk about other places. So look, with Russia, first of all, we already have NATO. We don't understand why we need more. Now also, if we go more, then this means that we need to follow our foreign interests. So we cannot be friends with them because we have nothing to gain, because we compete on control of the economy, because the Russians are anti-Western, anti-rights, and so on. What does that mean that would have to happen in their world? This means that now the United States would have to threaten Russia more and is more likely to go with war with them. And notice, Russians might be weak, but they have two fronts, the Ukraine and Syria and Daesh, meaning that the United States is now going to lose many more soldiers, is going to get itself much more in the mud and go even against its own interest of maintaining the Middle East safe. And we say that this is terrible. But then they ask about the Middle East. Before I go on to that, Zuko.
So pre-pivot, we managed the sunshine policy between US and North Korea, which promised North Korea swearing off acts of aggression in exchange for the US investing in North Korea's domestic industries. Your analysis of how this is going to inflame and embolden North Korea is just ahistorical.
Pre-pivot is irrelevant. What we say is the likely scenario is the after pivot, and we say that once you take back what you said, then things change, because according to their logic, the region is not the same as it was. Trump is not Obama, and that is why we don't think that this is likely to stand. But then let's talk about other places. So why do we care about the Middle East? Because A, it fights ISIS. B, because we do have oil that we trade with them. We do have interest in the Suez Canal that is very important to the economy and to American citizens, and so on. Now here, if we intervene there, it means we have to choose a side between Qatar and Saudi Arabia that now are in a conflict, between Israel and the Palestinians, which is now going to be more of a focus, meaning that we're going to piss someone off. Right now, we say that it's better to be with our hands back down, because at least we can be friends with everyone without saying that we prefer someone more, meaning that this is a better world than the alternatives that we get. So what have we given you? Their alternatives are not viable. Status quo is manageable and good for more people not dying and maintaining their national sovereignty. We are very proud to oppose.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. We welcome member of government.
Thank you for the floor. A few things in my speech. One, why foreign policy and generally deterrence is completely uncomparative in this debate, and it should be about some other stuff. Secondly, why our case is going to impact probably the most important stakeholder, and show you how Western centristic we are in debate, and explain to you how this is going to help 1.something billion of poor Chinese people living in China, and why that is the most significant point in this debate. Those people are also people in the same way that people from the US and Western countries are, and we argue that is more important stuff on this debate. Before that, some external points over about them, right? So the whole opening up case is based on a premise that US is somehow deterrence from China building artificial islands, right? So if you build the largest airplane carrier in the world and deploy it near Philippines, it is still unclear to us from closing government that somehow those airplane carriers are going to prevent China from doing what it does. We see that in the past 5 years, the vast military expansion of China has happened, had absolutely nothing to do with that, right? So it is completely unclear. You deploy millions of ships, right? Nothing is happening and nothing is going to happen. There are a few structural reasons for that, right? One of the reasons is mutual assured destruction, right? These are both nuclear powers. They're probably never ever going to engage in direct conflict. Hopefully all benches agree with that, right? But also they're never going to directly engage in the conflict with their direct allies. That is to say, China, even without this policy, does not have the incentive to have military intervention in Japan. You know that USA is still ally of the Japan, right? By not having millions of ships in South Chinese Sea does not mean that we're still not allies with Japan or South Korea and those countries. That is basically a straw man that opening up is putting on the government bench, right? Most importantly, dear panel, in this debate, you can just have a premise that US ships are deterrents for China to do whatever the hell they want in the South Chinese Sea, right? There's a clash in this debate that we should clash upon. We argue that there is absolutely no way in which these ships do that. And there's no need for reasoning, right? It is historic fact that in the past 5 years, the enormous military expansion of China has been happening. We're having more and more artificial islands. They want to get oil, etc., etc. US never ever is going to engage with potential huge trade partner, potential huge geopolitical partner, and nuclear power such as China. What are we going to argue? What we're going to argue in our basically all is rest on that premise, right? About deterrence and how that changes. So what are we going to argue in our case? Recognize China currently spends, I'm not going to bump you number, but let's say around 8% of GDP just on the military, just on the military spending. There are the reasons for that, and the reason they're doing that is exactly the US presence there, right? China still has an incentive to intervene, to take islands from Philippines because international law, 200 miles, we want to take oil, we want to take minerals, right? Stuff like that completely remains, and it's completely symmetric. Since US is not going to stop them, China spends enormous amounts of money on militarization. The question is, why China does so? Besides this reason, right? One of the reasons is they need to legitimize their autocratic rule, right? That is the way how autocratic regimes are partially operating. Even though there is no democracy, you still need to have some kind of legitimacy, you still need to have some kind of national identity, right? The easiest way to build national identity in autocratic countries as China is to build the narrative of the eternal enemy such as US. It is a lot easier for Chinese authorities to spend enormous amounts of money on on this heavy militarization, right? But the second is because the military structures are usually very powerful in the countries that do not have democracy. And these military structures now have very strong incentive to have the government pump up more and more money into military structures, right? Because generally military structures are ruling autocratic countries and stuff like that. There is no excuse for military to demand this crazy amount of funds the Chinese government is spending of the military if there is no US forces there. And the reason for that is, even if we agree with everything Bob says, right? Countries such as Philippines, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, doesn't really matter. Bhutan have absolutely no chance in standing against China with China's military technology 20 years ago, right? China in the status quo is enormous military power, right? Without deterrence, this means that China is in future going to put a lot of funds into developing their own economy, ultimately helping other people. There are 4 reasons for that, right? For one, there is going to be no more arms race, right? There's no reason and there's no excuse for military structures to demand money. Recognizing the status quo, China has to have this technology race that is occurring with US. There is no need if your enemy is now going to be Philippines or Vietnam, right? You don't have to pump up your technology. Secondly, there is no need for generally mobilizations, for generally trading, for buying expensive patents regarding military, buying new weapons regarding boots on the ground and stuff like that. Since you also have weak enemies. Thirdly, we say even if we agree that China is going to take islands from Philippines, from Japan and stuff like that, why is that inherently bad, right? They have historic claim on those islands greater than China. We argue that this is generally not important argument. We generally don't make an argument about historic stuff. So even if they take these resources, we say this is still beneficial. A, because they're going to have more money to help poor people in inner China, but B, because they're going to buy a lot less oil from countries such as Iran and Russia, and ultimately have a far worse countries which are doing far worse things in this world that China is doing. And fourthly, it's becoming politically not so favorable to do so. Before that, I'll take Monica.
A billion Chinese are still going to improve their lives irrespectively of the US policy that is still not going to be friendly because of the Belt and Road Initiative. But others are in the risk of losing their lives. Thank you.
Exactly, we have Belt and Road Initiative. However, we still have billions of dollars pumping into developing new technologies, right? They weren't listening to our case. This is an enormous comparative. If over 5% of your GDP is spent on the fucking military, right? 1% of China's GDP means billions of dollars that are going to be pumped up into Chinese economy, right? So even if that all is built, right? But regarding the threat, we're saying the threat is non-comparative because they're not going to engage with each other in China. And if they want to crush these countries, they're going to crush them on either side of the house. Why are they going to pump money into right stuff, right? For once, education in China has vastly improved. This means that people are generally craving for more and more stability. Now, the autocratic government does not have an excuse of military power such as USA standing in their way and pumping money into military, right? They need to, in some way, please the population of their country, right? Secondly, we tell you China has incentive to pacify its inner problems, such as minorities in these countries that they're oppressing, which some territories are on the brink of civil war and stuff like that. China has an economic incentive to help those people in order to maintain its inner stability, right? And U.S. president is not going to deter them from intervening in Bhutan or in China. That's completely that is completely off flash in this debate. But secondly, about generally transferring of China's economy towards service structure, where there is enormous incentive already of Chinese government to try to prove that, right? This is debate about the resources. We argue that over a billion people are going to be better off. There is no militaristic strategy is going to change. Very proud to propose don't be Western centrist.
We are told that the US presence inflames Chinese nationalism by intruding on its sphere of influence. If that is true, then this is the worst possible moment to reverse the US pivot to Asia. It is not a good idea, in the context of rising Chinese nationalism, to remove the one obstacle to military confrontation within the Asia Pacific. 3 points in this speech. First, I'm going to look at Asia, and particularly East and Southeast Asia. Second, I'm going to look at the US and its other strategic interests. And finally, I'm going to look at China and respond to the closing government extension. My rebuttal will be my extension. First point, Asia. The first and central claim from the opening government is that the US presence inflames Chinese nationalism. Two responses. Firstly, this argument commits a chronological error. The motion is not regretting the pivot to Asia, right? It's not wishing the pivot had never happened. The motion is, given the pivot has happened, should we now reverse it? If it is true that Chinese nationalism is inflamed by the US presence, then it has already been inflamed. And I'm going to explain why that doesn't evaporate overnight. Firstly, because attitudes have filtered down to and have been entrenched in the minds of citizens. This means, and the evidence for this is a vast increase in anti-US sentiment expressed on social media. We recognize that China isn't a full democracy, but we think the government still seeks support from and is responsive to the interests of its citizens to preserve political stability by hypothesis of what we hear in Etz's speech. So entrenched attitudes of anti-US sentiment and territorial nationalism are present in the minds of citizens. Secondly, because structurally, these attitudes have been entrenched in politics. The reason for this is that politicians use nationalistic rhetoric to further their career ambitions. You can't then roll back on that rhetoric post those ambitions being established afterwards. That looks like you're betraying a particular cause you've established for yourself. So what happens if you now reverse the pivot, given that this is the context we're debating in? Firstly, you have removed the only obstacle to genuine expansionism during a period of historically and uniquely all-time high nationalism. What would it do to the Chinese Communist Party after years of proclaiming that the Senkaku Islands, the Spratlys, the South China Sea are all rightfully theirs, but if now they do nothing after the US has left? I think there will be powerful political pressure from within the party, from citizens of that nation, to enact the exact sort of expansionism that their side of the house wants to prevent. This means seeing more military action, more territorial claims, and most crucially, with no one to stop them. But secondly, I just don't believe the premise of OG's argument, right? They say there are good reasons why China will behave responsibly absent the US. Note, if you look at your notes panel, the only reasons they give us are some vague gesturing at interest in stability. We're going to give you internal structural analysis of how the Chinese government operates. Note that Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese leader in decades. He is the head of many of the party's internal organs, unlike his predecessor Hu Jintao. He has unprecedented loyalty from military generals, and he has clear ambitions with deeply nationalistic attitudes. So the opening government misunderstands how power works in China. Given Xi's unparalleled power, he has carte blanche to pursue his ambitions in the world that they describe. Stability, which John talks about. Stability to Xi Jinping is stability through intimidation, right? And the reason we know that's true is because the South China Sea dispute predated the US pivot to China. Also, like Ed says, you need to justify war to your own citizens, but you don't really have to, given that the vast amount of power centralized within Xi's hands, this justification isn't necessary. But even if it was, we think that his justification is now there won't be a war because there'll be no US to stop us. So, what we've done here, when you're comparing us along the bench, we've broken the top half deadlock here. I think we stand completely behind opening up when they say that it's unlikely there'll be nationalism, that there will still be nationalism even absent the US. But crucially, we explained why, even if it is true on OG's case that this inflames Chinese nationalism, it's too late to go back on that. Now would be a bad time to reverse that. That's how we break it up crucially. Closing government's response to this is, so what if China acts more territorially? 3 responses. 1, war is bad. Second, international sovereignty and the international order is good because we think people generally have a right to decide what happens in their country, and being invaded is bad. Third, he says you can take resources and that's good for China. True, but then that's bad for the countries from whom those resources are being taken, right? And the actor in this motion is not China. We were then asked by the opening government, what's the comparative? Ed says the US is not necessarily more benevolent. Yes, but it is not true that our side has to stand for only US hegemony. We stand for a choice, as John establishes in his speech. When there are 2 active powers within the region, you have to choose between them. Why is that a good thing? Ed says the Asian Infrastructural Investment Bank offers 0 interest loans. That's true, but they come with vastly lower environmental and labor standards, right? It's a good thing for you to have competing frameworks of economic regulation and international alliance for you to choose from. It is because we think countries deserve to choose how they prioritize internally their development, their labor standards, and their environmental issues. Yes, having 2 choices isn't great, but it's far better than having only one. We think it's a bad thing the US pull out of the TPP, and we really hope on our side that they will. We prefer it on our side if they reverse that. Finally, we hope this will reduce the risk of accidental misfiring. Yeah, I think the most important accidental misfiring is probably North Korea, given that there will be a nuclear level misfiring. Note that we've recently seen unprecedented levels of cooperation between Trump and Xi on North Korea, right? Like, for the first time in decades, China has issued statements condemning the nuclear program. No, this only happens with the US presence. The reason for this is that Trump's increased and visible belligerence means that China has to cooperate to share that media space. They can't be seen to be doing nothing when the US is doing everything as well. So it's only with their presence that there is pressure from the one actor North Korea has historically been allied to and is responsive to, that is China, in order for them to decrease, to at least slow down their military program. And that difference really makes a difference to the stability of the region. Secondly, let's talk about the US and its other strategic interests before that.
If the logic is that instability is not a major deterrent for Xi Jinping because he's insulated from domestic pressure, the reversal of the pivot just looks like China has won, and Xi Jinping will similarly be insulated from domestic pressure.
But winning is not merely the absence of the US, right? China has made specific territorial claims over places, over islands and regions in that area. So that is what Xi pursues on your side of the house. And also, I mean, like, that's an even-if argument, right? So either Xi has unprecedented power, in which case your argument is doomed, or he doesn't have power, in which case your argument is also doomed. So, what's most likely? I think it's unlikely that the US will shrink its defense budget, right? Because Trump is quite eager to pursue sort of military action, given that that seems to be the one thing that you know, he's dropped bombs at unprecedented levels in recent history. That means countries start to take preemptive measures. If your argument is that you want the US to pivot to Russia and Europe, that's an extraordinarily bad idea. Russia doesn't have to engage in outright military confrontation with the US. You just have to launch hybrid wars to make that sort of war impossible, right? They have to destabilize nations bordering Russia, like the Baltic nations, like the one we're standing in today, just to prevent the possibility of the US having a foothold there. So that's the realistic kind of war we get on that side of the house. And finally, let's talk about China. Closing out says China will demilitarize and will fund all sorts of great things. Firstly, China has a booming economy. The problem is not the amount of money it has, but where it is being spent. And that doesn't change given the internal political pressures that China has. And finally, it won't, because China, as we've already established, Xi Jinping particularly has militaristic ambitions that will preserve that sort of military spending. So I just don't believe that point of extension. Look, it's too late for us to prevent Chinese nationalism from rising, but it isn't too late for us to prevent them from taking devastating actions with terrible consequences for the region, and that's why I'm very proud to stand in opposition.
So the best rebuttal that closing opposition can have on like China will invade inhabited islands that there is disputed between Japan and China or Philippines in China is, war is bad and some people will die. We believe it's just not really sufficient responses on the realistic scenario. I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, why direct conflict between like nations and people dying is something unlikely scenario, many structural reasons that exist here. Secondly, the comparative here is about resources, and on the comparative, this is the most important that you got from closing government. All rebuttals are going to be in my clashes. Firstly, about direct clashes. So firstly, there are things like mutual assured destruction between big countries that exist here. But secondly, there is also things like economical cooperation. Generally, countries like in Asia, they economically cooperate. There is also initiative from China in terms of AIP that they want to seek those cooperation. But also empirically, it's just true. Thirdly, it is easy for them because of geographical proximity to have economical cooperation. If you economically cooperate with one country, it is not in your interest to directly conflict with that country like fully in terms of invading Japan and just bombing their cities, etc. So all the harms of people dying are just not in this debate. Thirdly, there is usually wars are unpredictable. Note that China is really a big and complicated country that has this legitimacy on stability. There are many nations there. There are many chances of having civil wars, coups, many things that can happen there. The only way how Chinese elites and party can claim their legitimacy is if they provide stability. Necessity of that is for people. They don't want to risk those issues. Also, they claim, okay, for the United States it's going to be much harder because they're going to need 2.5 weeks to deploy their troops if they want to fight back. Okay, fine. That might mean that China will be much easier for them to do so, but they are still risk averse of by directly engaging with big countries, to having a big and direct conflict. We believe that this debate is not about them. It's really hard to justify those issues. Elites, it's really hard to justify those issues when you have all those issues. Then we have one reason for that. We need to credit closing opposition. They say, look, but there is also nationalism in China. Note there is also interest of people to have economical growth and economical stability. We're going to claim that economical stability for people is much more important than nationalism. Why is that? Because economical stability is something you feel everyday life. If you can more money, we can purchase things, etc. Then believe it's just more important for you than just expanding on just invading Japan and things like that. Why this is important? Why on the other hand nationalism? You can fulfill also nationalism without invading other countries. For fuck's sake, many countries are nationalistic, but not going to war with each other. Usually just simply by being able to get some islands that are not inhabited, is still going to just fulfill the nationalism for China without direct conflict with other countries. We believe it is important. Note that those incentive structures also work with other countries. Japan is unlikely to go to a direct conflict with China because of all the same incentive structures that exist here in this case. Now, why this is important? Because by closing opposition logic, they concede that there is some accountability of Chinese government from their people. Even if economy is more important, that means if they have more resources, that more resources are going to be trickled down by their own conceded logic of their case. Now, also, what we also get why conflicts are going to exist. They say, look, but other countries like Japan, etc. are going to militarize. No, where from? I mean, United States probably, if they're reversing people to Asia, don't want to militarize those people. All the other actions don't have really successful arms which can just combat China. But even if that militarization happens, we believe it's less important than all the benefits that we bring you here, and they need to claim the counterfactual. They also claim, oh, but nationalism is going to increase. How much? Abe is pretty much like nationalism. Duerte is pretty nationalist. I'm not sure, a little bit increase in nationalistic narrative, what is the consequences of this? While on the other hand, I'm pretty sure what means 5% of GDP being spent on other things and not on arms race is a pretty direct fucking impact on people's lives that live in poverty. We believe it's much more important than some vague nationalism narratives that we're just hearing all things. Lastly, they say, look, but China will going to be afraid and still going to just have those arms race. We disagree with this. Why that? Because by own logic of opening opposition brings lots of argumentation of how Russia is going to be more aggressive in terms of Baltic if there are more troops there. Know what does that mean? That means that argument is contingent on the fact that how many ships and how many troops, etc. you have somewhere, that means that more likely you're going to, as the other country, are more likely to spend more money on resources, on defense. What does that mean? That they concede our analysis that if we're going to have far less ships, even if some of them stay, that means that China is vastly going to reduce spending on their ships because they don't need to do those things. Also, why this is not comparative, OG respond to that. I don't need to respond to that. So this is the reason why this debate is not about conflicts. And even the conflicts exist, is going to be just seizing some of the islands. We can concede this, but we don't believe that the impacts of conflict that oppositions are presenting are existing in this debate. But what is exactly comparative? My second point of clashes. Yeah, sure.
even if China is not nationalistic and doesn't want more militarization by scared Japan and South Korea, will cause both to increase the military budget of China and both.
Okay, I understand. Sit down, please. Yeah, but still they have much more army than them. Still they scare them in the status quo. They don't have interest in scaring them much more. On the other hand, United States, as we heard from Janko's extension, completely unresponsive for political position, have much better technology, much more ships, are usually more likely to provoke China, to try to humiliate them, etc. That's why they have incentives in status quo to try to have this arms race, just lose those incentives in those issues. That is what is the comparative. Secondly, recognizing all the other conflicts that might exist, for example, conflict with India, is usually like those countries have less economic, like military power, so therefore like China will don't necessarily need to buy expensive and new technologies in terms of that. What does it mean? There are much more money that exists like in China that they can redistribute like in other ways. Note that Janko gave you a couple of structural reasons that are sort of conceded by closing opposition that exists in terms of that China has some like relations with their people in terms of redistributing money, etc. I believe that if you have more resources to redistribute, and if you have same incentives for people that they want to have more those resources redistributed, and even if you buy a little bit simply like given this concept, we believe that on the comparative we have more resources giving to the poor people in terms of welfare, in terms of economic growth, specifically given that China produces lots of things. So those resources that they're going to take from like those islands, they're going to use much better rather than some countries like Japan, etc. They say, look, Japan used those resources. Firstly, those resources are in disputed territories, so no one is actually using them. But secondly, even if they use them, they are much less used for Japan, which is a very rich country, and they don't have economy based on manufacturing like on the other hand China, which means that they can do much more those things with those resources. But finally, why this is the most important thing in this debate. Note that $1 in Japan or United States worth much less than $1 in China because of purchasing power, etc. Secondly, note that those poor people are much poorer and believe that they have much better responsibility rather than people in the West that exist somewhere like there. Thirdly, note that by a vast number of people, like there's 1.2 billion people or more people in China compared to the other people, we believe that just the impact and the scale of people that we have from closing government is the biggest. What we proved in this debate is that tension is just bullshit. And that this debate is about resources, the best use of resources we have in closing government. We need to go through this debate. Thank you very much.